Thanks to the gospel choir. I feel like I've been in church. Amen. Amen. So I told you yesterday that Lord has led my wife Lois and I to live out on the Pacific Northwest. We live in the little city of Oregon City, which is about 30 miles south of Portland, Oregon. And so the truth is that this chapel service is beamed all over the world live. And if you put up that first picture, yesterday morning, well, you'll see it in a minute. There's my grandson, and he's watching me preach yesterday at 7:15 in the morning. And I'm hoping he's watching right now. Owen, buddy, I'll see you tomorrow morning, okay? Opa loves you, and it was like, I have a video of him too. He's just like, he calls me Opa, and he says, Opa? And I'm preaching, and he just, he was amazed at his grandfather. So anyway, if you look at my grandson, he's just turned 2. I've got 3 grandkids. One is 20, one is 18, and one is 2. And the little guy, Owen, is just a little over 2 years old. And if you look at him, you think he's 4. He is huge, okay? His parents are very tall, and he's going to be even taller. But the truth is that if you were to look at him and say, what a big guy you are, he is like at the 90th percentile for 4-year-olds, and he's 2. You look at him and you say, what a healthy little guy, and that wouldn't be the whole story. So if he had been conceived when my other grandchildren were born, in that era, he wouldn't have been conceived. The truth is that the breakthroughs in medical science is the reason that my grandson Owen is alive today. My daughter would not have been able to carry him to term. When he was born, the kinds of issues he faced were dealt with by a magnificent group of medical wizards in a neonatal intensive care unit. So when you look at him, you see this healthy guy he's just a wonderful person. He just fills me full of joy. But that isn't the whole story of Owen. And that's the case with the story I want to look at today. What meets the eye isn't everything. You've got to look deeper. And the story I want to look at is a very familiar story, to me anyway. It's found in 1 Samuel 3. And I want to read the story, or the crux of the story to you, just so you hear it, okay? Sometimes we gloss over what the real story is, and I want you to hear this. So this is 1 Samuel 3, about the first 10 verses. Now the young man Samuel was ministering to the Lord under Eli. And the word of the Lord was rare in those days. There was no frequent vision. At that time, Eli, whose eyesight had begun to grow dim so that he could not see, was lying down in his own place. The lamp of God had not gone out yet, and Samuel was lying down in the temple of the Lord, where the ark of God was. Then the Lord called Samuel, and he said, Here am I, and ran to Eli and said, Here am I, for you called me. But he said, I did not call you. Lie down again. So he went and lay down. And the Lord called again Samuel, and Samuel rose and went to Eli and said, Here am I, for you called me. But he said, I didn't call you, my son. Lie down again. Now Samuel did not know the Lord, and the word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him. And the Lord called Samuel again the 3rd time. And he arose and went to Eli and said, Here am I, for you called me. Then Eli perceived the Lord was calling the young man. Therefore Eli said to Samuel, Go lie down, and if he calls you, you shall say, Speak, Lord, for your servant hears. So Samuel went and lay down in his place, and the Lord came and stood, calling at other times, Samuel, Samuel. And Samuel said, Speak, Lord, your servant is here. That is a very poignant story. A superficial reading of that might lead you to say that it's the story of an old leader passing away, sort of an old guy with old-fashioned, old-school way of doing things being replaced by a young, powerful, spiritual leader. But the truth is that there is more than meets the eye here. So if you really want to know this story and where Samuel is in this moment that we just read about, you got to look at the previous chapter. And the truth is that the previous chapter tells us how Samuel got to this particular point. See, the story that we just read is only understood when we understand how it got there. And it isn't just as easy as saying old out, new in. Spiritual deadness being replaced by spiritual life and a new powerful leader called Samuel. Because the previous chapter tells us a story of a mother who was obedient and persistent and a father of integrity. So Samuel's mom's name was Hannah. And the truth is, she was living in a tough circumstance. She was a mother who was barren. That has always been a difficult time and understand. You know, we who are men cannot understand those kinds of things. It is tragedy. But in that era, it meant God's favor was not on your life. And so here is a lady who has not had God's favor on her life, and to top that off, she lives in a culture where husbands can have multiple wives. And she is one of several wives, and her competitors do not make life easy for her because she's barren and they've borne a lot of kids. So you can imagine Hannah living in a circumstance where she had no identity and where she was constantly being berated by her fellow wives. That's interesting to say, isn't it? But she persists in her relationship with God. And she says, "Oh God, if you will just give me a child, I will give you that child. You can have that child." Elkanah, who is the husband in this whole thing, sees the kind of treachery that is going on in this group of wives. And he is kind to Hannah. As God's sovereignty would occur, Hannah bears a child. And she keeps her promise, and she gives him over to the temple to, in a sense, be an intern with Eli. Now, Eli is at the end of his career as a judge, and the fact is that his family and his sons are just flat out dogs. They are just bad people. So hear the story now. Samuel is giving over to Eli as an intern. Eli has failed with his own sons, and you have a mom who has finally got the blessing of the Lord on her life, giving her son into that kind of toxic, dysfunctional family. See, it isn't all that we think it is. And so, what we see here and what we need to learn, I think, is the simple fact is that we can look at any snapshot of life, and it isn't always what meets the eye. That the fact is that this story that we see emerging now is a story of a persistent mom, a father with integrity, and a God who is in charge of the whole thing. So today, I'd simply want to say to you that your own destiny, as much as you think you're on your own, has never been created solely by yourself. For better or for worse, we are people who have a history. We are a people who have come from certain places. And the fact is, some of those things that you remember about those places in your life are things you'd rather forget. But the simple fact is that God is orchestrating the whole. And he is preparing you for moments of destiny that you cannot even imagine. So just don't get on your high horse and think whatever successes you have in life are because you did it yourself. You may have been a prime mover, but there is context. There is a backstory. There's another chapter to be read before we look at those moments of success that have come into your life. So another thing we see in this story, the piece that we just read in chapter 3, is that knowing and hearing the voice of God is important for every generation. Every one of you needs to hear. You can't rely on moms and dads and grandparents and other people. You've got to hear for God yourself. Verse 2 in what I just read said, "And the word of the Lord was rare in those days. There was no frequent vision." So we could look at that and we could say, hey, God wasn't speaking to folks during that time. And it was very, very difficult. The fact is that God was not necessarily not speaking. He was speaking. People couldn't hear. And the fact is, I just ask you this rhetorical question, like if God would speak to you, would you know his voice? And the reason is there's so many other voices in our lives. They're plugged into our ears. They are bombarding us at every moment. We wake up in the middle of the night to allow other information to come into our life. How can God get a word in edgewise? That's really the question. And it's a question today in very specific ways. And it was, in these ancient times, they had their own version of that. It was quite obvious that they didn't have necessarily all those streams of information that we have today. But the fact is that they could not hear a God who was speaking. And so it was a rough time. We see in this story that there comes a point in this internship that Samuel has with Eli that it's a normal night. And they both go to their places of rest. We know that Eli, it says, he's sort of failed with his own family and he's blind now, he can't see, and he's at the end of the road. On that particular night, Samuel has gone to sleep and he hears a voice. And he thinks it's Eli because Eli calls him in the middle of the night for a variety of things. He goes the first time and Eli says, "It wasn't me," go back to sleep. He goes back, hears the voice, goes back the second time, and Eli this time is a little bit perturbed. Sends him back, but begins to wonder, I wonder what that is. Third time, Eli realizes that it isn't he, but God who is speaking, and he says that to Samuel. He says, "You know what? It isn't me, but if you hear it again, then you need to say, 'Here I am, Lord, speak to me.'" Now, here's the deal. Samuel could hear the voice of God, but didn't know what it meant. Eli couldn't see, couldn't hear. But when he heard the nature of what Samuel was saying, he knew it was God. Even in those moments where we think somebody in our life is messed up and toxic and dysfunctional, it may be that they still have a vestige of connection to God that can speak to us. So, don't be so high on your horse thinking that you're in charge of your life. There's a whole layer of things. Some of them are not so pleasant. Some of them are very pleasant. But you and I need to know that God is still in charge of that whole story. And the fact is that you need folks that you think are off the shelf. You need folks in your life that you think are not the most amazing people. They may not be in the know. They may not have the current dress and understanding and speech, but they still are people that can hear the voice of God and give you direction. Because in that moment, where Samuel finally in this encounter with Jehovah God says, "Speak, my Lord, for your servant is hearing." He moves, in that moment, he moves from young intern to young prophet. In that moment where he says, "I'm listening. I'm going to put away all those other things that come into my mind. I'm going to listen just to you. Lord, speak, for I'm here to listen." What a huge statement. It's from that statement, if we read the rest of this story, chapter 3, chapter 4, and on. I mean, it's a long story of Samuel's leadership. It all boils down to that moment, that decisive, defining moment, where he says, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." That moment where we realize that all the voices we have listened to cannot compare to the voice of God. That moment where we realize that all the voices we've listened to have led us on a wild goose chase, have led us in circles. And we thought at the moment that they were conclusive and gave us clarity, but we realize after a while that there is a voice we need to listen to. It's the voice of the Lord. And what's interesting is that here's this young guy who moves from intern to prophet when he speaks, and God says, "Let me tell you something." You follow here, and God tells him, in the first conversation that they have, God says, "You know what? You need to go tell your mentor Eli that he's toast. That he and his whole family are done. I'm done with them." Imagine that interesting thing to say. That's exactly what occurred. And yet, through that moment, through that middle of toxicity, Samuel prevails. The fact is that God has got your back with all the minefields of your life. The stuff you've stepped in, the stuff that other people have stepped in for you and dragged you with them, God knows those minefields. And he can take you through them if you will say, "Speak, for your servant is listening." So I want to show you one last picture before we close this morning. This picture is of a young man whose name is Dr. Luis Gonzalez. And this picture is of Luis Gonzalez with your president, David Kim. And this occurred just a month ago in Panama, about the conference I told you about that the digital media team came to, Child Hope Conference. President Kim was there and spoke in the conference, trying to build relationships there with UVF and Child Hope, and also at the International Church there in Panama. So you look at Dr. Luis Gonzalez, and you say, here's a bright guy. The fact is, he is bright. He has a BA, MA, a PhD, and is working on a second PhD. He's a really bright guy. He's a wonderful friend. But Luis Gonzalez was not always Dr. Luis Gonzalez. He was a little boy in a barrio in San Jose, Costa Rica, who went to a Child Hope school. He was typical of little poverty-stricken boys in that neighborhood. When you asked him a question, he would never look you in the eye. He was soft-spoken because he was always talked down to, not talked across to. He was used to deferring. He was used to keeping his hand down. He was used to accepting fate. He was a child of poverty. But one day in our school, one of the directors had a bright idea of having a contest that would result in the child who won the contest getting a bicycle. And Luis said, I want that bicycle. And he had to memorize 58 scriptures if he was going to win the bicycle. He set about memorizing 58 scriptures. He set them all in front of the teacher and won the bicycle. But the rest of the story is this. In that moment, the teachers realized that there was potential in this young boy.